This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Late Late Show. My name is Kathryn Taylor. Tonight, my special guest is Andrew Alcock. Andrew is a teacher of philosophy, religion and ethics and is currently an ECT 1. However, he's returned to teaching after a challenging NQT year several years ago.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Good evening and welcome to the Late Late Show, everyone. I'm Kathryn and I'm speaking to you live from Buckinghamshire in the UK. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, Mr.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
And we'll come back to those messages in a minute. I just wanted to introduce my guest this evening, Mr. Andrew Alcock, who is a philosophy, religion and ethics teacher and is currently an ECT 1. However, there's a bit of a story to this, as Andrew, I know, is going to talk to us about in a moment, because he actually undertook his training several years ago and had a quite challenging NQT year. And as a consequence, ended up leaving the profession for a short while and doing other student-facing roles, student support roles over the years. And I know he's going to talk us through some of those details in a minute. We'll be discussing Andrew's story, and it's a really interesting one, I think, because he's got a particular perspective on the NQT year as was and the current ECF arrangements for teacher training. So we're going to get his reflections in just a moment. Andrew, I'm going to bring you into the studio. It's really great to have you with us this evening. How are you?
So far, so good. I'm hoping that the tech is working. Is that audible?
It is. Any errors are completely my fault.
Right. Okay.
Really great to have you on. Thank you for calling in. I wonder if you would just like to start us off in this conversation. What attracted you to teaching in the first place? Because you've taught religious studies and philosophy, religion and ethics. So what motivated you to take that path in the first place?
Originally, when I was a late entrant into education in the first place, because when I left school, I went straight into work after my A-levels, and I worked in retail jewellery, and that was fine for what it was. And it wasn't until a couple of years after that I started to get involved with my local church, and as usual in those places, the one place they always want people to volunteer, especially if you're young, is with youth. And so I was doing quite a bit of stuff with children and youth work. And then I got more interested in theology as a subject. So it was more, I think the subject drove the idea of getting into teaching. So later, having gone to Bible college, which coincidentally is where I met Mrs. Alcock, I came back from that. I went back into retail and I wasn't satisfied. And I wanted something that was more substantial, where I could use the skills that I'd started to develop in doing youth work on a more regular basis. So I went and worked at a local high school in a student support unit. And this was effectively and I don't know if we'd get away with doing it now, it was a permanent internal exclusion unit. So we had 4 or 5 students who, for various reasons, weren't allowed on the main site. This was an older building that was attached to the school, belonged to the school, but it wasn't on the main site. And so we were doing core skills with them. I don't know if any of your listeners will remember the old progress files from about early 2000.
Gosh, I don't know. That's taking it back, isn't it?
And so students would build up a portfolio of stuff that they could do. But what we didn't get was any real training on the SEN needs that these students had. And they all had various different needs. And they were all in there primarily because the school couldn't get rid of them off roll. And therefore had to accommodate them somewhere else. And I did that for about a year until, and this was another thing that I've noticed has changed over the years, is that the funding for a student's SEN only lasted as long as that student was with the school.
Okay.
And so when one of the students who was in year 11 went off on exam leave, the school decided to show me the door. Because there were other, as usual with schools, there were other internal politics going on about the future of this unit anyway. But in that, it's often a really useful learning experience for someone who wants to be a professional, about how to deal with in and out day-to-day interactions with students who have got complex needs. And I'm not talking about physical complex needs, but what I suppose we'd now call neurodiverse needs. And these were all undiagnosed, and we've got so much better at it.
So this is around 2002, you think?
Yes, this is about 2001, 2002. And if I think about the students that we had, they would all, definitely ADHD, ASD, and all kinds of things. And we just didn't identify it. They were just troublesome students. And the solution was, effectively, we'd just medicate them up to the eyeballs, because we put them on Ritalin, and they would be far more compliant, but they would be, pretty
presumably it was a medical oversight. I don't want to suggest that you personally were handing out the tablets.
Sorry, that sounded like we were dealing out of the back of the classroom. We weren't. What it was, some students who actually were diagnosed, the immediate response was to put them on Ritalin, and basically tranquilize them. And you could tell the difference, or we can now, when we've got students who have forgotten to take their medication. But now we understand how much, what the impact is and why that's an impact. And we, the medical professionals and the ed psychs and all that side of the process have got so much better at doing that. So that was there for a year. I then spent an entertaining summer working as an LSA in a Young Offenders Institute.
Oh wow! What's the comparison between this sort of on-site PRU that you've described and that? That seems like a really interesting move.
That was kind of, I knew I was going to university by then, because I'd deliberately done some extra A levels whilst I was working there, working at the high school. And so it was work over the summer. And it was effectively a summer program in the education department, because even though these boys had to be incarcerated, they were still entitled to an education. And so, but that had, its own interesting atmosphere. Most of the time, it was actually quite relaxed.
Yeah.
But the advantage as a member of staff was that you knew very well that if something did go wrong, there would be, and I saw it once, 15 huge blokes charging down the corridor like a herd of elephants and flattening whoever it was. And the incentive for the boys to behave was simple. If you start messing about, you're going to get a warning, and then you're going to go back to your cell, and you're going to be there for the rest of the day, and you'll lose some of the privileges that go along with it. So the carrot and stick was very, very immediate, and actually really quite effective. But you did have to have your wits about you. So there was one day I was teaching students how to write a CV and a letter of application, because the idea was that they did training in various jobs. They wanted to get back into work in order that they didn't get back in again.
And were they all in their sort of late teens then, these lads?
Most
or early
of them.
20s?
No. So because it's young offenders,
Okay.
It's up to 17. Once they get to 18, they go to remand, and from remand they go to what they used to call big boy prison, basically adult incarceration. But we had there were a couple who were 14 or 15, but most of them were around the 16 or 17 age range, and they were in for all kinds of things, and some of them were going to be in for a very, very long time. So they'd start off, and there were a couple who they'd been on the front of the local newspaper for some actually quite an egregious offence. And so they were going to be there for the next 8 years. So they started in at 14. They were going to do 3 and a bit years in young offenders, and then they were going to go off to adult prison. But they would do their education. So there's one day we're teaching, or I'm in there by myself, and I'm teaching them how to do CVs and letters of application. And again, this is one of the, you had to be very, very chilled, because any sign of weakness or anxiety or nervousness, and they will pounce, because it is that kind of dog eat dog world whilst you're in there. So it's taking it very, very chilled. And they're trying to get me to sit down at the teacher's desk, and I'm like, "You're all right. I'll walk. I've been sitting down all morning. I'm just going to walk around a bit." And it's not that they want you to go away so they can get on and not work or do something, write something naughty or anything. It's because they put something on the chair. So you have to have your eyes about you. And then there was another day, whatever the task was, and bearing in mind that what these boys have been in for, and one of them says, "What would you do if we took you hostage?"
Okay.
Which is the best. In all the 25 years that I've been in education, I think that's the best question I've ever had. And my response was, "Well, probably just get bored," which diffused the situation. But again, it's that ability to keep yourself in a not feel threatened by it.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I think I'd like to have a bit more of, that kind of little bit more chilled in the classroom to respond to those.
So that's really interesting, and I want to sort of bring the conversation around to what happened next, because what you've described is, and I know a little bit about your story and what happened when you became an NQT. So I just sort of want to sort of draw a contrast between that environment, which actually many people might find really challenging and quite threatening, to going in down to the local comprehensive, which we'll talk about in a minute. Before we do, I'm just like to remind our listeners that if you are listening in live and like to join us, either post questions in the chat for me to answer, or if you want to call in and speak to us, then please download the Podbean app and visit ttradio.org and click on Listen Live on the homepage. This will take you directly to the show, and there you can post comments and ask questions during our conversation, or call in to join the conversation by call in by pressing the icon at the top of the page on your phone's app, and click this and we'll be able to connect you. So I'm just going to play a couple of messages, Andrew, if that's okay, and then we'll come back. I'd like to pick up your story when you're doing your PGCE and moving into that first NQT year. Okay, we'll hear from you on that in just a few moments.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
Welcome back, and I'm just going to bring Andrew back into the conversation because we've talked already and heard some really interesting things from you, Andrew, about your experiences first in that kind of on-site PRU, as we might describe it, and then in the young offenders for the summer. So you finish there and you go off and you're going to, let's fast forward to when you're doing your PGCE. How was your training year?
The PGCE training year was again, this comes, part of it was slightly problematic, and it may well be that I'm just one of those people who makes people who irritates people, but my wife was working in a school at the time, so I was doing my PGCE, and my short placement was at a local comp. Not a very high achieving comp, in an area of quite a bit of severe deprivation. For any of your listeners that know the Northeast, it was in one of the former pit villages. So the pit's gone. There's little employment, little aspiration, and it's that kind of environment. But again, you walk in, and this is one of the things that as an ECT, you have no idea about. And I suppose even for people coming into a school, into a new school, you really have no idea about the internal politics of what's going on. And it turned out that the head of department was at loggerheads with the head of the school over something or other, which meant that, support wasn't really there. And so I knew of another good school, although it was a new school. It was part of the one of the early academies, and it had combined a few things together. And this was actually a really useful experience that I came into later. And I negotiated with the school's head of department, with the head teacher, with all of the staff necessary about arranging a placement. And because my course tutor at university didn't have a prior relationship with the school, she wasn't prepared to allow me to go there. So I ended up at another school in the area, which again was in an area which was quite a deprived area. Better performing, but again, still the challenge of my two schools in my PGCE were actually quite similar in profile, which meant that although you learnt quite a bit about classroom management, actual more higher skills of delivery and teaching, that difference between managing a class and teaching a class, I didn't quite get to that point.
And what? Just sorry to interrupt. Where's this in time?
So this is my PGCE. So I did my degree. I took a year out afterwards, and then went back and did my PGCE and I graduated from there in 2007.
Okay, so just the reason I ask is because I find that comment really interesting about how you, the difference between managing the class and the pedagogies that you would have to teach the class. And only because everybody, I imagine, who's worked in any English school in the last 18 months will have been familiar with Rosenshine's principles, and that's 2012. So, I think the point I want to make is that many people trained and developed their practice in an era that is prior to the kind of cognitive science approach that we're all now becoming really familiar with. And I don't know, I'm just trying to note, I suppose, that, don't be too hard on yourself, because there's things that we know now, that we learn now, that we put into practice now, that nobody was really doing, and if they were doing it was by accident. So I just want to put that out there.
Well, the other thing was that it was the framework of learning how to plan and prepare a lesson was really, really rigid. Every class,
5-part lesson,
3-part lesson with clear, you had to identify your kinesthetic and your you had to identify those 3 different bits. What part of your lesson is the kinesthetic part, and what part is I can't even remember. It was TAK, and I can't remember what the other 2 were.
I think we all remember those days. Well, and have been around long enough.
and writing your lesson plans to the minute. So your introduction is going to be 2 minutes long, and then there's this, and sometimes it was a 2-part, a 3-part, or sometimes it was a 5-part lesson, and you had to have a plenary. Your lesson was considered not good enough if you didn't have a discrete and clear plenary addressing the question, what have we learned in this lesson?
Did you do the almost sum?
Yeah, had all that. And then
I'm getting flashbacks. I'm triggered.
Well, also, so I noticed some of the stuff that I've seen recently. We've got learning outcomes, which makes sense, but we used to have aims and objectives, and it took me for ages to try and get my head around what's the difference between my aims and objectives, and why are they not the same. And you just get told, well, that's what they are, rather than, well, this is how you distinguish between the 2. So that was my PGCE year, and that had its own challenges in and of itself. And the other part of that, coming out of the PGCE in the Northeast, the availability or the openings for RE teacher jobs is really, really minimal. You have to go travel for miles. So from time to time, I for whatever reason, I keep an eye out on the job pages just because I'm nosy. And earlier this year, I could have put in my own postcode and there'd be 10, 15 jobs within 15 miles of where I am. If I put my dad's postcode in, which is near where I used to live, you have to go 50 and 70 miles to find an RE post. Now, part of that is because he lives basically at the northern border of civilization in England. So he's just in Northumberland. And so once you get 20 miles north of him, it's all sheep, and that's all there is to it.
And they don't want to learn about RE.
No, they don't. No. We've tried. Well, that's what we used to try. So Bible College was a residential college, and there was a sheep farm next door. And so when people were practicing their homiletics, they would be walking out in the field evangelizing the sheep. But so the end result of that was I ended up getting a job through my wife's aunt down in Northampton, but at a PRU. And I was supposed to do my NQT there. And that was going to be in conjunction with a local school. But the problem was I was getting 2 hours a week in the local school, which, I'm not convinced would have been enough hours to actually complete the NQT. But again, it was working in a PRU, and that was another environment where being chilled, not being easy on the students, but being chilled was a primary feature. And you had to be able to not take yourself at all seriously. And that was one of the other things I noticed, that having come to a grammar school in the southeast compared to comprehensive schools in deprived areas in the northeast, the amount of personal questions that you get and the things that they notice, in deprived schools, they'll go, "Why is your tie not the same color as ours?" "Well, because I get to choose what color tie I wear. I get to choose what color socks I wear." "Yeah, but that's not fair. We have to wear them." Well, and the kids in my current environment don't care because it's not a thing for them. So the attitudes are massively different, and I don't know how much of that is to do with their background or where they're from and how much deprivation there is. But anyway, so I did a year at the PRU, and I was working away from home, and Mrs. Alcock was. Her career was progressing, actually. So she'd got a job. She was looking at a job as an assistant vice principal in her school. So I went back up to the northeast and then spent the next 2 years working in the learning support unit, which is where I learned an awful lot more about things like dyslexia and dyspraxia and ADHD and ASD. And the school was actually a really, really good school. Because it had incorporated 3 support bases in it. So it had deliberately been built with hearing impaired students in mind. So all of the classrooms had a sound field. So if you had someone with a hearing impairment in, then you automatically came with the Roger, and that was great. If we also had the visually impaired, so hearing impaired, we had students who were profoundly deaf, and so we had signing staff, and we had some staff who were teachers of the deaf, which is an extra skill in as much as you've got to be able to teach your subject. So you might be a science specialist, but you've got to be able to sign whilst you're teaching that, which I'm sure your listeners can think, well, how do I deliver? How would we deliver epistemology if we had to sign it? I'm sure there'd be fair,
Andrew, I don't know how you teach epistemology with words.
But you get the idea. So there's that. And they had a visually impaired base, so some of the materials would be put into Braille. And then we had a moderate learning difficulties And so that was a great experience in terms of learning how to incorporate students with extra SEN into a regular school environment. And it made you think of all kinds of things. So whoever designed the building must have sat down and thought, right, our primary focus is how do we make this accessible for VI students, for HI students, for students in wheelchairs. So all of the doors were like a door and a half.
Yeah.
And so, and so classroom layout became very, very important to allow students in wheelchairs to be able to maneuver in and out rather than just, oh, you get the first bit by the door because, that might just be their own physical need. The rest of it, they might need to be in the whole classroom. So in terms of that mindset, it provokes me anyway to think about when I'm planning my lessons, if I take my primary focus to be the student, in our context, it's we're more likely to have students with neurodiverse needs than necessarily physical needs, although, some hearing impaired students. But taking those into account and planning for those first of all, because fortunately for me in a grammar school, I say the rest, that sounds kind of like a them and us, but students without extra needs are far more adaptable than students with extra needs. And therefore, if I plan for those with extra needs, then the ones without the extra needs, actually, they can work it out anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, it turns on its head the way that I did my PGCE, which was plan your lesson, then differentiate.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I tell you what I'm finding really interesting, because what I'm getting from you is that you've engaged with a very wide range of young people with a very diverse range of backgrounds and very diverse needs. And what I want to kind of move around to talking about, if it's okay with you, is that NQT year, because
we're getting there. Yes,
we're getting there. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, I made the first mistake that I made, and this, this is, if anyone says to me that they're thinking of teaching, my first, make sure that your school is within reasonable travel distance, so that you're not just looking on, it's however long to get to school. Actually, what's it going to be? I didn't have Google Maps when I worked this out. I just knew it was about an hour's drive. And so I wasn't particularly worried about that hour, but then there were traffic complications. And so what ended up happening was I was traveling for far too long, and especially at rush hour, it was making it far more difficult. And you don't need, that's the thing you can do without.
Yeah.
You've got enough other things going on. You don't need to be having to get up at 5 o'clock in order to leave the house at 6 o'clock to avoid getting stuck in an hour and a half worth of traffic. It's just not worth it.
No.
And so that's just a general piece of advice. Don't leave your school so far away from where you're going to be. And the school that I went to, the context was, it was part of an academy trust, and the academy was it was a faith-based one. It was a Christian foundation, and they were really trying to work hard in deprived areas. And so this was another part of the Northeast, which had a rich mining heritage, but the mines had stopped years before. And so it's on a council estate. It's taken over from about 2 or 3 failing schools. So it's designed to be a 3 to 18 all through academy, obviously on 2 different sites, but it's a brand new building. And I get there in the 2nd year that it's been going. And I'm all mad keen and enthusiastic for, this kind of outreach and, bringing a positive good to the local area. And it's actually quite close to where I grew up, although I was living further away at that time. It's really quite close to where I grew up. So it was, I had a lot of heart for the job and for the location. But with it being a brand new school, that brought its own complications because the school was still in the throes of establishing itself. And there had been complaints in the local press about heavy-handedness and far too many exclusions and, all those things that happen when someone in a school starts really putting in very high expectations, expecting students to meet those expectations and being really, really firm at what happens if they don't. Because the background of this is why, it's not why schools fail, but one of the things that can contribute to it, as I heard in Inset this morning, was, we've got to have consistency with behaviour policy. We've got to have high standards because that's what creates that environment for learning. And that's true. But when you're trying to establish that against a backdrop where that wasn't necessarily the case, that can create conflict. So within that, the school was extraordinarily rigid with its behaviour policy. In that, everything had to be done exactly the same way. And that was a comment that I've heard in Inset the last couple of days, that there are certain environments where everything has to be done in exactly the same way to ensure consistency. And I suppose that, if that's what helps you with your, professional skill set, then great. If it doesn't, then it's not a good place for you to be. But then on top of that, the head of department, because it was a faith-based school, and I was working in the RE department, and therefore RE is a very high-profile flagship department. That meant that the head of department was very heavily involved in senior leadership stuff, and so we had 3.5 in the department. And 2 of us were specialists. The other one was a history teacher, and the part-timer was an English teacher. And so my responsibilities on my NQT were along the lines of I had to plan materials to cover the work that the 2 non-specialists wouldn't be able to plan, because there's no legacy of work. Everything's new. I was asked to rewrite the Key Stage 3 scheme of work 3 times in 2 terms, on top of my other regular work. Books had to be marked with a 2-week turnaround. Now, that sounds not too bad, but when you've got an RE timetable, and you've got maybe 15 different classes, possibly, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. It seemed maybe 10. It seemed like an awful lot. It was about 10. And you're new to the job, so you haven't got that quick eye. You're having to read everything quite closely and mark it accordingly, and the feedback had to be in a certain fashion. But one of the other things that they were trying to address was, coming from a low base and low literacy, every SPAG mistake had to be corrected. Every single spelling and grammar mistake had to be corrected, which meant that you could spend 15 minutes on a half or 3/4 page piece of work, and 3 of those minutes would be the content. The other 12 minutes would be identifying and highlighting every single SPAG mark. And
So did you thrive in this environment, Andrew?
Well, we'll come to what happened at the end in a moment. And so it was just, if you've got 30 books, 15 minutes each,
it's a lot.
And that turnaround was just impossible. I was getting in for 7:15 in the morning. My colleague, who lived a lot closer, he was getting in at 7:00. I was leaving at 6:00. And this is with an hour and a half, hour and a quarter travel on either end. And still with work to do at home. And I just didn't have the rewriting the Key Stage 3 scheme of work, and being told that you shouldn't use textbooks for lessons because that's not professional. You might as well just be a technician and just hand the books out. And that's not really, books are useful, and I'm not saying we should bin them all together. They're not the be all and end all, but at the same time, writing work for non-specialists to deliver, if the textbook is there, then
it's a helpful tool.
It's a useful tool. Let's not throw everything out. And so just the sheer workload was impossible. So I got to the Easter holidays. Mrs. Alcock and I ended up in 2 different local authorities. So her holiday started a week earlier than mine. So she went away and I joined her a week later, and she just looked at me and went, "There's something wrong with you." And so I came back, and I actually ended up having a breakdown. Just because of the huge workload and the amount of pressure and the lack of support that was given. So in terms of, with my view and what I've seen from the ECF so far is there's,
because sorry to interrupt, just to say, just so we keep the thread of this all happened in 2008, 9?
No, 2010, 2011.
Okay, so but around that sort of time, and now you're back having done various things in between and doing the ECF because the NQT year was sort of curtailed, wasn't it?
Yes.
And just so I'm just filling in that just for listeners, because it's clear that you've had a really challenging time and you've come back for more. So
I know there must be something wrong with me. But so the big comparison is, so on the NQT there was no guidance, there was a massive overload of work, there was no support. The best bit of advice I got from my head of department was I'd taken 5 minutes out to go down to the staff room, pour myself a cup of coffee, and I sat down on one of the chairs and just closed my eyes for 2 minutes to get a breather. And the comment was, "Have you got a non-contact?" Yeah. Well, you shouldn't be down here drinking coffee.
Yeah. It doesn't sound like a very healthy working environment.
It wasn't. And I think part of it was that, unfortunately for the head of department, they were under so much pressure to get it right as well. And so, there were all kinds of things within that. But after 2 terms, I just, I got signed off by the doctor and I was put on medication. And that medication, I was actually on the medication for the next, I think, 9 years or so.
Wow.
And in one sense, it worked out not too bad, because in that, after leaving, that summer, my son was born. So I was able to be off work and at home with him. So I did the daddy daycare thing for about 3 or 4 years, gradually going back part-time and doing still learning support work and stuff like that. And then various bits in schools and learning establishments as maths HLTA, and then working in an alternative provision. But what I found was, and if I reflect on different...
Sorry to interrupt, Andrew. I wonder whether it would be okay, just so I'm noticing the time, I wonder whether it would be okay if I just play the news. We've got about 7 minutes of news, and when we come back from that, if we could just wrap the show up in the last sort of 5-10 minutes with your words of wisdom on everything. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Fabulous. All right, we'll be back in just a few minutes then.
Yeah.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Get set for the year ahead with the Bloomsbury Education Back to School sale. Save 30% on all Bloomsbury education books until 30th September. From the very best in research-led practice to trusted advice on inclusivity, behaviour and curriculum design, we've got something for everyone. Visit bloomsbury.com/B2S sale to shop now and save 30%. Bloomsbury Education, books for every step of your teaching journey.
How can you show your students the opportunities that await them? How can you fuel their aspirations and motivate them to achieve? Futurum Careers provides a wealth of stimulating resources aimed at encouraging 14 to 19-year-olds to pursue careers in STEM and SHAPE. We help you to show your students what they can aim for and how. From articles to activity sheets, animations to podcasts, all our resources align with Gatsby benchmarks and are free for you and your students to download. Visit futurumcareers.com and subscribe today. Futurum Careers, helping teachers to inspire the next generation.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
BBC News reports on the uncertainty over the future of vocational courses, with over 450 schools and colleges in England saying they are unsure which courses they can offer in 2025. The government is conducting a review of post-16 education, and the Department for Education says this will support BTEC students. But the results of the review will not be out until December. This means schools and colleges are unsure which courses they can offer students in September 2025, despite having open days scheduled in the coming weeks. 450 schools have written to the government saying that the uncertainty is making it extremely difficult to plan for the future. Not only can they not tell prospective students which courses will be on offer, they can't tell staff either. More than 200 vocational qualifications, including BTECs and other post-16 courses, were due to be scrapped under the previous government, but days before the first funding changes were due, Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson said there would be a pause and review. The 455 schools and colleges in England have joined the Protect Student Choice campaign, a coalition of 25 education organisations and unions. The review comes against a backdrop of issues that have plagued the rollout of T-levels, introduced 3 years ago. Ms Phillipson confirmed T-levels will continue, despite high dropout rates and issues with exam boards. Schools Week highlights the names of the 12-strong panel appointed by government to review the curriculum and assessment. It follows the appointment in July of Professor Becky Francis, the Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, to lead the review. The panel includes Academy Trust Chief Executives Cassie Buchanan and Dr. Vanessa Ogden, SEND consultant Gary Orban, and exams expert Professor Joanne Baird. It also includes Reach Foundation Curriculum Director John Hutchinson and Funmilola Stewart, who leads on equality, diversity and inclusion across the Dixon's Trust. Professor Francis said, "We have ensured that primary, secondary and post-16 sectors are represented," and added that alongside its call for evidence due to launch in September, the review would engage and consult with crucial stakeholder groups and work closely with education staff on the ground. Full details of the panel can be found in the article on the Schools Week website. Hundreds of students are set to miss out on Freshers Week because their accommodation will not be ready. This is according to BBC Bristol, which says Bristol University brought forward Freshers Week so students living in the new Bedminster Metalworks block will struggle to attend events as the residence will not open until the 14th of September. The university says the 819 students affected will be compensated and has offered £250 and promised extra events. But student union officers say the news leaves a sour taste. Legally binding contracts for the new accommodation mean that moving in date cannot be changed. The university brought the Freshers Week date forward after a review of its academic year. In Wales, record numbers of pupils are being educated out of mainstream schools according to new figures. The figure of 2,279 is more than twice what it was in 2009-10 and 28% higher than before the pandemic. The Welsh Government said since the pandemic there had been an increasing demand for provision other than at school, including for physical health and mental health, as well as issues such as anxiety. The figures released do not include those educated outside of school due to parent choice. This has also been rising. Full details of this story can be found on BBC Wales. Finally, The Guardian reports that cleaners at a prestigious UK girls' school have won a dispute over pay and conditions. A strike that was due to take place next week has also been called off. The group of cleaners belonging to the United Voices of the World, a grassroots trade union for low-paid migrant workers, voted to strike after the school's contractor wanted to reduce their working time from 43 to 38 weeks a year, but offered only a £1.55 hourly pay rise in return. After the vote and appeals from teachers and former students, the contractor offered more pay, annual increases, and to meet the London living wage from next year. Whilst the James Allen's Girls' School, known as JAGS, declined to comment, it is understood that former pupils distributed leaflets about the strike and called on the school's leaders to set a good example to its pupils. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Brilliant, and
You've
that's a really, really interesting set of news stories there. Do check them out on the websites mentioned, and perhaps some of those will be mentioned in the weekly review as well, coming up on Sunday. We're going to go back to Andrew in just a minute. Now, just to recap what we've heard from Andrew so far, really, really fascinating story of sort of wanting to teach, really enjoying working with young people in a variety of really challenging settings, and then ending up in a very high pressurized environment with very high work demands and an enormously long commute, which unfortunately had a very negative impact on his mental health. Now, I think that the big question really, and I do want to thank you as well, Andrew, for sharing all that, because I know it's not easy, and I really do appreciate it, and I think it's such an important thing to hear talked about openly. But what we all are dying to know is what brought you back, because you are now back, 10 or so years later, and you're having another crack at it and you're doing your ECF. So talk us through that. Let's spend maybe 10 minutes just wrapping up with a positive, hopefully, a positive end to this story.
I think what brought me back was not really a sense of ever having left. It was more a sense of I'd had to go on the bench and I'd had to go in recovery. And there were times when I looked at other careers and I'd tried other careers, but when the opportunity arose to come back into teaching, which was, I came back in working in schools about 4 years ago. And then, and that was as a cover supervisor. And then I did a stint working as a pastoral support for Key Stage 4 in a local school. But then the opportunity to actually get back in the classroom as a formal teacher really just, the door opened up. And it seemed to me that, if you've got a skill set, that it's almost a shame to not use it. If the opportunity's there and you've got the skill set, then it's, I don't know, a sense of obligation. If I was doing Gilbert and Sullivan, I'd say a sense of duty. But then part of it is I just really, really enjoy the environment in the classroom. And I think for those who are considering the profession as a career, those diligent ones who are doing all their research before they even go into it, the first thing to recognize is that, I would not, if I could go back, knowing now what I knew then, I would not go into it then. Simply because the framework, as I see it, was just not set up to allow people to grow into the profession. It was almost as though, right, you've done your PGCE, here's a year, we're going to make sure that you're, or we're going to watch you closely to make sure that you're not going to mess up badly, and then we're just going to set you off. Now, it may well be that there are thousands of teachers out there who had a much better experience than me, and great, happy days. But I think what it's taught me is that understanding the context of your school and really knowing who your head of department is are the key features before you choose which school to go for. Because my experience is that, teaching is a lonely job.
Yeah.
You are, and it's not us against them, but you are one voice in front of 30. And the pressure, whether it's said, whether it's implied or not, whether you put it on yourself, there is a pressure there to deliver stuff well. And if that pressure isn't there, then either the school's not doing the job or you're not taking it seriously enough. But that pressure shouldn't be punitive, and it shouldn't be burdensome, and it shouldn't be overwhelming. It should be that sense of, I want to do this well because the students deserve deserve my best. Now, it's impossible for everyone to operate at 100% all the time. But if we kind of go, I'm going to operate very well for nearly all of the time, for most of the time, and then when I need to, I can step it up. That's a manageable thing. I think if you go, you have to work at 100% all of the time, you're just going to get burnout, and people aren't going to do it. So I think I'm very fortunate that my head of department understands the balance between work and well-being, understands the doing stuff for the sake of doing stuff is actually a waste of time. If something's going to be done, then it has to have a valid and valuable reason and good contributive reason for doing that, rather than, well, we've just done this always, you know, and that doesn't work. But also that your head of department or your ECT mentor or whatever stage you're at you need to connect well with them so that they can understand you and you can understand them. And if you've got a good ECT mentor, they will be able to see things coming that you don't recognize yet because they've got the experience and you haven't. And if you take the analogy of a driving instructor, excuse me, if you take the analogy of a driving instructor, even when you're 15, 20 lessons in and you've got plenty of time on the road, there will be things that your driving instructor is looking for and seeing that you've not yet learned to see. And so I suppose my final comment would be that the best comment that my ECT mentor said was that it takes 10 years to get to be a really, really good teacher. And I think there's an awful lot of people go out into the profession, do their PGCE, then do their ECT year 1 and year 2, and then have massively high expectations of themselves, which are totally unjustified after such a short period of time. And so you are, if I could speak to myself again, you are nowhere near as good as you think you are. At the same time, you're nowhere near as bad as you think you are. You're just at the start of that process. And if we understand that actually the process of becoming a really good teacher takes an awful long time, then that helps us, and I wonder whether if we could get that through to all those people who leave after 3 and 4 years. I wonder how much of that is because of unrealistic expectations,
from the schools and maybe from themselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are some who come in and they light up the school and they are the next the IBYTs, the International Bright Young Things, and they're going to set the world on fire. And they are. But it's like, if you want to take a football analogy, Sven-Göran Eriksson, just because he's relevant at the moment, he took Theo Walcott to a World Cup tournament as a squad member at the age of 17. Theo Walcott was nowhere near the player he was going to be. But that experience at the age of 17 made a big difference to who he was when he was playing 4 years later. And so I think,
it's quite a paradox, isn't it? It's like you need to walk through the fire a little bit, and we need the distance. Well, I mean, it's going to sound very philosophical, but we've got to have the wisdom to know the difference. I think we can't do it all straight away, and it's not a failing. That's the truth. Yeah. But we do gain so much from every experience that we have, and it's really, really interesting, and I think a little bit of philosophical thinking.
Goes your ECT mentor is your best friend, and as long as you can trust your ECT mentor, that makes a huge difference. So earlier in the year, in January, I had a panic attack on my way to school because I had really I'd underprepared for a particular set of classes, and I had over high expectations of what was going to happen next. And it all just blew up on my way to work, which is, not the best place to have a panic attack driving along at 60 miles an hour. But space away, confidence from my head of department, who is also my ECT mentor, to actually say, well, we'll work this so that you can get back in and get back on with things, rather than You might have some who say, look, you're just not cutting it. If this is what's going to happen, you might as well leave. And it's like, no, you've got to see the process through. And sometimes there are a couple of steps backwards. There are going to be stumbles in the road. But if you expect your teaching career to be, one positive thing after another, then you've been misled somewhere.
Yes.
I was speaking to a friend of mine who's in another school, has a wealth of teaching experience under their belt, years and years and years, and they've had a problem with one class this last academic year. And one or two characters in that class have made it extraordinarily difficult. And you just go back to day one and you're like, I don't even know what I'm doing. Where do I start? And so, but the other part of it, if your ECT mentor is on your side, which they should be, otherwise, why would you be an ECT mentor? And if you've got people in your department whom you can trust, and you can then walk out of a lesson and say what you need to say entirely off the record without fear of someone going, oh, I think so-and-so is going to do something ridiculous about this student. You have to have that safe environment to be able to express your fears and your frustrations and your failures and all of those things in order to be this is my opinion, I might be wrong, other people might work in a different way, but I think you need to be able to express all of those things in order to be able to get back up on the horse. And sometimes you need someone to help you get back up on the horse. Sometimes you can just vent and you can, get back in there and everything's washed away.
Yeah.
But I think, for those people looking at schools, make sure you know the ECT mentor. Make sure that you can be, I'll say, work friends. Making that distinction between personal and work, but work friends with them, and that you are confident that they have your back and that the school is a good fit for you. There are some people who are great in challenging schools, and there are other people who are absolutely brilliant in high achieving academic schools, and if you swap them over, they'd sink. So you have to make sure the school's right for you, but you also have to make sure that there are people within your sphere, in your school, that you can trust 100%.
Well, it's that psychological safety, isn't it? I think we just can't learn, and we have to be ready to learn. And if we're not, then, what are we doing? Do you know what I mean? I think it's really important. Yeah. Andrew, I'm so delighted that you've come on, because two things: you've been so candid and so honest, and I think it's such an important conversation that we have around mental health in general, particularly around men's mental health, and I think it's been really, really brilliant that you've been able to come on and be so candid, and I hope that anyone listening back on the podcast will be able to really appreciate that. So I really do thank you for that. We are going to leave it for tonight now. You're welcome back to come and continue the conversation another time if you would like. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Good night. Good night. And if you have enjoyed this, please remember that there are plenty more podcasts and radio shows that go out live, and of course the weekly review on Teachers Talk Radio. So please do continue to join us and log in and visit the show and listen to the great many variety of recordings we have out there. Thank you very much, and join me in 2 weeks' time for another Late Show.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.